it's Shannie from Mountain Products Stained Glass Studios. Let's talk about setting up your soldering station. Safety first, don't forget your mask, your gloves, and your face shield. You want to work with a fan blowing out the window to take the soldering fumes away from your face hole. And don't forget a comfy chair, because you're going to be sitting a while. Let's talk soldering mats! First up we have the Homosoap board. This is cork. I don't have a Homosoap board, so just pretend. Homosoap looks kind of a lot like cork. The pluses are it's thick, it doesn't do heat transfer below it onto your table, and you can put pins in it to hold your pieces in place. It will get pretty schmecky after a while, and they are a little bit more costly. Corkboard, our second option. 1/2 inch is great. All of these things are linked in my favorite tools and supplies, by the way, if you want to look them up. It's great because, again, heat transfer, not too much because you have the 1/2 inch cork here. You can put pins in it. It's cheaper, but it does get very schmecky over time, so you're going to have to toss them. Lastly, and my favorite, I discovered this a couple years ago when I was working on a piece of corkboard and I kept having solder BBs land on my lap because my table was not level. I got myself a silicone dog food mat. Check this out. Big old lip on it, no more solder BBs. The pros are, well, that. 2, you can wipe it up super duper easily. Just a little bit of water and a paper towel, you're good to go. And lastly, it lasts for freaking ever. Oop, not lastly, it's also cheaper than the other 2 options. The downside is that if you have a table underneath it that you really care about, there is heat transfer through it, so you might want to get some cork anyway and throw some corkboard under it or a piece of plywood like I have. Now you got your mat and your space down, let's talk about tools. You're going to need a soldering iron. Obviously, the Haku 601 is numero uno, your BFF. You need a little soldering station, little holder to hold on to that. I like this dude, he's very heavy so it doesn't get knocked over easily. And here's a little water bottle because you need to keep your sponge wet so you can wipe your tip on that wet sponge. And this guy just works well. Very easy. Whee! You're going to want some tip tinner. Whoa. This stuff works wonderfully if your tip is no longer tinned, as long as it's not completely shot wrecked. You can use this to retin your tip and make it like it's brand spanking frickin' new. Let's talk Flux. Whether you're using liquid, gel, or paste, you do not want to contaminate your original jar. If you do that, it's eventually going to stop working and you're going to end up chucking like 3/4 of a jar of your stuff. So there's a couple of different ways you can go about not contaminating. One is don't ever stick your brush in the original container. Number 2 is if you're using liquid or gel, just dump out as much as you're going to need for the project at hand. Always err on the side of less because you can always add more in. If you put too much in, then you got to dump it out and waste it. Stick it in a separate jar. Baby food jar, mason jar works great. Have a separate jar to the side. That way you can dip, squeeze off the excess, nitrile gloves, squeeze off the excess, and put it on your piece, throw it in the jar. There's still flux in those bristles, so when you need to flux again, there you go, back in the jar, until you get to a point where you happen to have to re-dip and squeeze again. If you're using paste, you can just put a little bit on a little glass jar, a little container, a little lid, a piece of paper towel, anything you want, and just continually use that area instead of using the jars. Either way, don't contaminate your big Hawken bottle. When it comes to solder storage, if you're using your stuff daily, you won't really have much of a problem. Something like this, as you can see, is nice and shiny, still everybody's kosher. If you haven't used it in a while, it will start to oxidize, especially if you've touched it at any point during another soldering project and you got a little bit of flux on it. It's never a bad idea, if you're not going to be using your solder for a little bit, to stick it in a Ziploc baggie and pull out, squish out as much air as you can to keep that from oxidizing. It's not that you can't use it, but it does become a little bit more of a pain in the butt. A separate little jar to keep your solder BBs and shorter pieces in so you can use them later, because solder ain't cheap. When it comes to your tools that you're going to use for your soldering, things like tweezers, clamps, wire cutters, craft knives, little pliers, anything that you're going to use, keep a separate set just for soldering. As you can see, they're going to get schmecky from that flux, they're going to get oxidized and funky, and so keep them completely separate. You do not want to be getting this all over your hands and getting it on your glass, getting it on all the stuff in your studio, so totally separate set. A little locking tweezers is great for when you have to desolder and fix a piece and you need to be pulling foil off. Works wonders. Wire cutter, cheapy's great, you're gonna wreck it. Love this little set. It's tiny and it gets into small areas easy if you need to do a quick jump ring or a hook or a hanger, or even when you're desoldering and you need to pull off some foil, these guys can really help. The wire cutter that comes with it is good for about 20 gauge-ish. Anything that's thicker than that is, so go with this, dude. You want to have an extra craft knife in case you missed any spots for foil. These are my favorite little clampies. And they will eventually melt a little bit, and you're going to have to replace them over time, but they're cheap. You get a ton of them, and they work great for holding onto your glass so you're not holding on to hot glass. This is one of my favorite tricks. It's a wooden dowel that we sharpen down to a smaller point here, and when you're tinning your pieces and you don't want to have to hold on to it, boom, you just hold it, and wah, 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 wah. Super easy. You can find links to all the tried and true stuff that I love and use in my favorite tools and supplies, and come join the Peace, Love, and Stained Glass community. You can ask me any questions you got and learn all about stained glass. Peace, love, and stained glass. Bye!